I've called this talk, What Do the Rocks Say? And with a title like that, I should first apologize for not offering a soundtrack. Instead, I'm going to spend the first part of this presentation on a myth. This myth is constitutional for a corporate, landowning kinship organization. If it helps, think of it as a clan located in the mountains in central Flores, eastern Indonesia. The myth tells of a man, a lazy younger brother of a hard-working older brother. This younger brother, his name was Ulu, spent his days idling. He much preferred taking long baths to toiling in the fields. One day, the older brother, Liko, was fed up with his younger brother's errant appearances in the gardens and told him to go away for the rest of the day and spend it relaxing in the river. Ulu did so, and after a long time in the water he began to shrink. In the process he also became quite globular, and in the end he was the size and shape of a little ball. When, late in the afternoon, Liko stopped working, he called for his brother. Ulu answered in a small voice from between the rocks in the river. But Liko couldn't see him. Finally he understood that the small ball-like thing was in fact his brother. He pitied him, picked him up, and put him in his shoulder bag. Thereafter he always carried his brother around with him, giving him the morsels of food he required to stay alive. But one afternoon, as Liko picked up his shoulder bag to return home, he found it empty. Ulu had disappeared. He had flown away to the south, across the Savo Sea, to the island Sumba. On arrival, he landed at the top of a banana plant. After a while, someone arrived to cut down the plant and slashed at the stem with a bush knife. Be careful, I'm here," called a tiny voice. The Sumbanese flinched and rushed back to the village to fetch his friends. They spread out a sarong, had Ulu jump into it, and proceeded to take the plant down. Ulu was wrapped in banana leaves and left to himself, together with the bananas stored to ripen. As they matured, Ulu began to grow toes, feet, fingers and arms again, and finally he regained his former size. So far, so good, and it gets better. The Sumbanese had no mouth at this time, so they'd never tasted food. Ulu surprised them by lighting a fire, something they'd never seen, and threw sticks of bamboo on it. The ensuing small explosions amused them so much that their faces ripped open and made it possible for them to actually eat. Ulu then fed them baked bananas. Cooked food, another novelty, pleased them enormously. Ulu became popular and remained with the Sumbanese. One day, the woman in the house where he stayed was going to give birth. Ulu noticed the husband going outside to wet his bush knife. Ulu asked him, "Why?" "Well," answered the man, "my wife is giving birth, isn't she?" "And?" said Ulu. "I have to cut her open to get the baby out, don't I?" "Do you?" said Ulu. "Leave this to me. Just take your bush knife with you to the field, and I'll see to matters here." When the husband returned at dusk, the new mother and her baby were both alive and well. The husband was stupefied. Until then, all Sumbanese babies were delivered after first slashing the mother's belly open. The husband was tremendously grateful and gave Ulu a lump of gold. From then on, Ulu served as a midwife to the Sumbanese. For every baby he delivered, he received a piece of gold, and with time he became quite rich. Years later, another Florenese came to Sumba by boat. Ulu wanted to return to Flores, and the boat owner agreed to take Ulu and his worldly possessions across the sea. But Ulu was deceived. He was left empty-handed on the beach, watching as the sailor disappeared into the distance with all of Ulu's wealth. Despondent, Ulu fell asleep on the beach and began to dream. In the dream, a whale approached the shore. Promising to take Ulu to Flores on his back, the whale told him to fetch 2 rocks, to hold 1 rock in each hand and steer the whale with them. If the whale strayed left, Ulu was to hit it with the rock in his left hand, and if it veered off to the right, Ulu was to hit it with the other rock. Soon they took off at great speed, and arrived in Flores before the sailor with his booty reached the shore. The myth turns quite dramatic after this. Ulu struggles with the cheating sailor for the wealth. The whale helps him by summoning the entire ocean, threatening to flood the sailor's village, and finally Ulu gets it all back. With his fortune, he established himself as a man of renown. He married, and the couple founded that corporate kinship organization I mentioned at the outset. According to well-kept genealogies, all this took place some 15 generations ago. When villagers told me that Ulu's two rocks, known as the horse's reins, were still around, I was naturally interested in seeing them. When I was also told that they contained inscriptions, but in a script my interlocutors didn't know, I became positively excited. Thus I volunteered to photograph them, thinking that the inscriptions might be in a script such as Old Javanese, or another old Indonesian script, or perhaps Arabic, used in classical Malay. If so, I could show the pictures to specialists. Hopefully, an identification of the script would result in a message deciphered, and finally, a communication from the mythical past would reach Ulu's present-day descendants. But although I was allowed to see the rocks, I was told that they may only be removed from their box, concealed inside a stone wall, when pigs and water buffaloes are ready for sacrifice, and a subsequent banquet is arranged for the villagers. At the time, I simply couldn't afford that, so I had to let the matter rest. This was in 1990. In 2005, I was back in the same village for the inauguration ritual for a new built house. Such rituals are crucial events. Kin and affines, friends and neighbors, sometimes a couple of thousand people come from far and near, celebrating for 3 days, becoming witnesses. On this particular occasion, Ulu's two rocks would be taken out into the open for everyone to see. And yes, I wasn't only allowed to take photographs, I was encouraged to do so. The prospect of finally finding out what Ulu's patrimony actually meant was clearly enticing. So, here are a few pictures, and I invite you to share what I discovered. I confess that I was impressed with the patterns in the two rocks. They are, as you can see, clear and distinct. But I was also immediately convinced that if I wanted to find out what the rocks had to say, no specialist in old Oriental languages could help me. Then one of my most trusted friends, a retired elementary school headmaster, came up to me and asked what I made of the patterns. I couldn't bring myself to reassure him that the riddle would be solved. Instead, I told him what I thought. And I watched how his expectant optimism turned into sad disappointment, and he walked away. In the evening, after having gorged ourselves on meat from the sacrificed animals, I was asked again, this time by a much younger man. I told him the same thing. He was not disappointed. He got angry. Controlling himself, he said that if he and his family hadn't known me well for more than a decade, he would have punched my nose. Of course there was a message there. That's what the ancestors had said. That was what had been passed on for centuries. And that was how he knew. The ancestors wouldn't lie about something like this. I didn't press the matter, nor did I feel inclined to tell all and sundry about my conviction that whatever the rocks had to say, it would not be to a philologist, but a geologist. Only in April 2014 did I follow up on my hunch to contact a geologist friend, sending him some of the images you have just seen. He passed them on to a few colleagues. They soon reached a conclusion. These are known as trace fossils. From the photographs alone, the geologists weren't able to determine the organisms whose traces these are. But their informed guess was that one likely culprit would be a certain kind of so-called burrowers, the Rhizocorallium. To simplify, one example of such burrowers would be the common earthworm. These organisms burrow in the soil, that's how they feed. At one point their tunnels are filled up with one kind of material, while the surrounding area consists of another. The technical term for this is bioturbation. Give it some geological time, and the fossilized material in the crisscrossing tunnels is what we're left with. I now want to declare my allegiance to a certain view of what we are facing here. One way to rephrase the conundrum is to say that it is an instance of the much maligned nature-culture opposition. Locals say that the rocks in question do contain an ancestral message, only since the locals lack the skill to decode it, it's unknowable. On the other hand, we have a fairly unanimous verdict by geologists. The traces in the rocks were made just before the dinosaurs ruled the world. I don't need to remind you that the ancestors were not around at that time. At any rate, Ulu wasn't. For him to have been around in the Triassic Age, he would have had to predate Homo sapiens by hundreds of millions of years. This leads me to posit that the rocks in question simply cannot have been inscribed by any intentional agent. In other words, the meaning in the rock patterns cannot be elicited by specialists in the humanist or the social sciences. That is the job for natural scientists. This is my point one. My point two springs directly from the first. Now, I'm the first to lament some of the unfortunate outcomes of the epistemological nature-culture divide, the scientific understanding of human disease and suffering, just to mention one. However, in this case, it seems to me that what the locals consider to be a cultural object, that is, a message from the ancestors, cannot be accepted by the anthropologist as accurate, or indeed as the truth. To do so is simply to gainsay the knowledge of our colleagues in the earth sciences, in this case a rather futile exercise. So, my second misgiving is this. What the ontologists seem to me to be concerned with, and exclusively so, are matters to do with religion, belief, or faith, usually of benign consequence. This, of course, means that any skepticism voiced by unimaginative ethnographers is laid to rest at once. If Amazonians say that jaguars see themselves as human, then the jaguars do see themselves as human. But let us note that whenever ethnographers report such things, it is because they have been told so by Amazonians. We should remind ourselves that they haven't been told so by the jaguars. Thirdly, whether certifiably religious or not, what the ontologists report as the truth pertain invariably to phenomena that by their very nature cannot ever be verified by disinterested observers. I stress this because we're sometimes told that what anthropologists in the past have not really taken aboard is the sheer alterity of other people's ontologies. If we are baffled by or don't understand them, it isn't because they are silly or irrational. No. It is because they live in another world. In some of these worlds, jaguars and peccaries are human. In other worlds, diviners can only speak the truth. The issue isn't that shamans and diviners think they can only speak the truth, or that their clients think that they can only speak the truth. The point, we are told, is that diviners can only speak the truth. They do speak the truth, full stop. Now, while I have now raised issues pertaining first of all to objects featuring predominantly or prominently in ritual, I wish to close by turning from the nature-culture conundrum and the patently religious or metaphysically speculative phenomena that the ontologists are so fond of, to another and more acute one, that of political extremism. About 5 years ago, a man stood trial in Norway for having first set off a car bomb, blasting government buildings in the capital, killing 8 persons, maiming others. He proceeded to a Labour Party youth camp where, masquerading as a policeman charged with securing the safety of the participants, he shot and killed 69 of them and wounded many more. The official count is 319. I talk about Utøya, Norway's 9/11, if you like. The crucial issue prior to and throughout the trial was whether or not the perpetrator, Breivik, was sane. Thus, 2 teams of court-appointed forensic psychiatrists examined Breivik before his trial. The first report diagnosed Breivik as a paranoid schizophrenic. A second psychiatric evaluation concluded that Breivik was not psychotic during the attacks, nor during the evaluation. Let me rephrase this, blunt enough for my purpose here. Was Mr. Breivik operating in his own world, or was he operating in ours? I am relieved that the court decided that the latter was the case. On 24th of August 2012, the Oslo District Court issued findings that Breivik was sane and guilty of murdering 77 people, and he was sentenced to 21 years in prison. In short, Breivik was sentenced to prison because he did what he did in our world. This verdict, one I approve, indicates to me that the questions raised by the ontologists are far too fundamental to be exhaustively discussed in the context of belief or faith. There are other, more ominous issues at stake. The ontologists admonish us to take the other seriously. Indeed, returning finally to Ulu, to take the account involving the rocks seriously cannot mean to humor my interlocutors by saying, sure, there is probably a purposeful inscription there. That, I submit, would be to abandon the notion of what taking seriously actually means. In fact, to tell them so would relegate them to an alterity they simply don't deserve. Thank you.